All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This here is an educational channel, and we, sorry, I'm a little preoccupied, but, we generally tune into great, what is going on now? This has just been a big, series of technical difficulties. But anyway, we generally try to tune you into great theories or earth-shattering discoveries, magnum opuses, tour de forces that are pretty obscure, maybe esoteric, and you probably don't know about them as a result. But if you did, they'd make a big impact on your life. Today is our 219th Bible Decode, and we've been probing the ins and outs of the Roman origins hypothesis. How much did the Romans have to do with putting together the Gospels? And we've looked at some more total theories, such as Joseph Atwill's book Caesar's Messiah, Michael Menescot's Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And now we're looking at a book that is called Operation Messiah. And this book argues that Saul, or Paul, was in fact a Roman intelligence agent, and that his whole thing was surveillance over the Nazarene movement. That's the movement of the apostles after Jesus died, James, the brother of Jesus, and also Peter. And then the kind of infiltration of that group in order to water it down, turn it into a more of a kind of pacifistic spiritual movement as opposed to any type of political or military connotations. Now, I don't feel like they go far enough with their theory, because if you read Paul obviously in his epistles is quite pro-Roman and quite anti-Jew in orientation, especially in terms of the Jewish rituals. He's recruiting Gentiles into Christianity and doing away with things like circumcision and graven images, strictures against graven images, and kosher food laws, changing the Sabbath, and so on and so forth. But if you read the Gospels, Jesus does the same thing. And they seem to not pin it down on Jesus, but just to pin it down on Paul. And then they give kind of more aggressive interpretations of what Jesus says, and kind of, trying to maneuver around, rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and being a prince of peace, and walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, and turning the other cheek to oppression, and all of that, but emphasizing it when Paul does it. Okay, so we are about to start chapter 6 of this book. This book is, again, called Operation Messiah. It's by Rosemary Sheldon and Thies Voskuilen. And yeah, about to start chapter 6, On the Road with Paul, Tarsus, Antioch, and the 2 Jerusalem conferences. Armed with his Roman nom de guerre, our agent Paul began spreading his message to people beyond the confines of Judea. His travels, mission, and message are all matters of debate. in spite of the huge investment in labor that students of the Christian scriptures have proffered, trying to harmonize the two incompatible accounts of Paul's missions. The itinerary found in Acts and that implied in his own letters cannot be reconciled. Among the points of dispute are the number of missionary journeys Paul made, the locations and order of his visits, the number of visits he made to Jerusalem, and the dates of all these events. Paul did not write a single line about his physical environment during the thousands of miles he traveled by foot, caravan, or ship. We do not know how he presented himself, whether he used his Roman name, whether he wore a toga, as was his right as a Roman citizen, or if he presented himself as a Palestinian Jew. What message was he spreading? Who was supporting these activities? It seems possible that, dressed in the sheep's clothing of an apostle rather than a uniform, Paul's constant traveling may have been an extension of his police work in Jerusalem and Damascus. Paul's approach to the Jesus movement in Damascus could be repeated elsewhere. A deception operation of this size would have been relatively cheap and very effective. Paul could travel from one city to the next, preaching his pacifistic message, undercutting the Nazarenes' nationalism and their interpretation of Jesus. This was a highly provocative way to set up camp inside Jewish religious communities. All of Paul's activities during his so-called missionary journeys can just as easily be attributed to an agent working for the authorities as it can be to religious work. Conveniently for Paul, those two activities are not mutually exclusive. Okay, this section is called the First Jerusalem Conference, 37 AD. Now, just to point out, the Roman origins hypothesis basically is that the whole Gospels are fiction. They're written by the Romans for the purposes of social control, to mellow out the Jews, a psychological operation against the Jews. And they wrote the stories in the 70s or 80s AD and backdated the story to the 20s or 30s AD. Now, Ralph Ellis, in some of his books, really contends that the stories in the Gospel, they appear to be set in the 30s. They say during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, and Tiberius was the emperor from 14 to 37 AD. But the events that are described are occurring in the 60s AD. And so he says that the events of the Gospels are really the events of the Jewish war between the Jews and the Romans from 66 to 73 AD, which included the utter destruction of the Jewish temple at Jerusalem in 70 AD by Emperor Titus, by General Titus, who eventually becomes one of the Roman emperors of the Flavian dynasty. And that war gave the Romans the impetus to use this psychological operation to write the gospel story and, feature a Jewish Messiah who was not a military commander, but a prince of peace. But this date, 37 CE, or 37 AD for Paul, for the Jerusalem conference, I just find that to be very early. Paul's first journey in his new Christian guise took him from Damascus to Jerusalem. His reasons for traveling there are obscure. Some have argued that since he was chased out of Damascus, his journey to Jerusalem may not have been entirely premeditated. Escaping from the jurisdiction of the Nabatean king would have been enough of a motive, but infiltrating the Nazarene community in Jerusalem could have been another. These were the closing years of Pilate's administration, and they were marked by extreme disorder in Palestine. The way Judea's most famous governor flouted religious and national sentiment had provoked the very pious and the political extremists into riots, which brought Roman retaliation. Pilate is even said to have put agents in the Jewish crowd to provoke them, giving him an excuse to use violence on the crowd. The Nazarenes were caught up in these events. The rapid increase in the number of adherents to the way was probably connected to the repressive contemporary conditions. What better time for the Romans to send a provocateur to keep an eye on these events and fan any smoldering aggression so that it could be flushed out and then eradicated once and for all. If Paul's mission was, as we have argued, to infiltrate the Nazarenes, then visiting Jerusalem was exactly where he needed to go, right into the belly of the beast, to see if he could pass as a new Jesus follower. We think Paul made a deliberate decision to travel to Jerusalem to seek out the true leadership of the Nazarenes, to get to know them by sight, and to convince them of the validity of his Damascus vision. If he could establish a Nazarene identity and religious bona fides, it would make it easier for him to travel among other Nazarene communities. Since his persecuting activities had taken place at least partly in Jerusalem, he was going to need to mend some broken fences. Having spent 3 years in Damascus participating publicly in the life of Jesus communities, he may have thought it was safe to return to Jerusalem, armed with his conversion story and perhaps letters from members of the Damascus Messianists. From an intelligence point of view, job number one is to know your targets. The only reason Paul himself gives for visiting Jerusalem is that he wanted to meet Peter, which fits right into this pattern. While some interpret this story as just making acquaintances, others argue that the purpose of the trip was to gain information. Some may interpret this as religious information, but we might also suggest that he was gathering political intelligence. It seems unlikely that, as many people wish to believe, the only relationship between Peter and Paul was their shared allegiance to Christ. There is more going on here than simply two teachers exchanging ideas about their faith. Acts reports that Paul returned to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and it is the latter who introduces him to Peter and to James, the brother of Jesus. This brings up the subject of who Barnabas was and what his role may have been in the story. Was he part of the undercover operation, or was he a dupe who believed the story of Paul's bogus conversion? Barnabas had to be a convincing speaker because he needed to sell the story of the conversion of Saul the persecutor to Paul the believer. Barnabas had to explain to the most important Nazarene apostles how Saul saw the Lord, who spoke to him, and then testified to the fact that Paul had spoken out boldly in the name of Jesus in Damascus. Not surprisingly, Acts reports that all of the apostles were afraid of Paul, and they certainly did not believe he had become a Nazarene. Paul states clearly in Galatians 1:19 that he stayed in Jerusalem only a fortnight, which seems strange if his intention had been to remain longer on his mission or even remain there permanently. All he seems to have accomplished is a meeting with Peter and James. Does it not seem odd that Paul spent 2 Sabbaths in Jerusalem, yet never encountered any apostles, even in the context of public worship? One scholar suggests that Paul was in danger the entire time he was there, and thus an element of secrecy was necessary. If he spent his Sabbaths with Hellenistic Jews and was only visited with the Palestinian Nazarenes briefly, this might explain why he did not know them by sight. It may also be that James and Peter would not let this provocateur anywhere near them. There is no mention of an invitation to come and see them. Paul himself ends the passage in Galatians with a very strange defensive statement. Now, what I write to you, behold, become God. I do not lie. That's in Galatians 1:18. How interesting that in his own version of the story, written many years later, he eliminates Barnabas's role, shows himself as meeting only 2 apostles, and takes an oath to convince his audience that he is telling the truth, which was apparently still an issue. There seems to be much that has happened about which the reader is not being informed. Paul and James probably did not talk about trivia. We must assume James questioned Paul on his experience with Jesus. After all, Paul's vision of Jesus was belated and unusual. Pauline scholars assume that they discussed the message to be spread about the resurrected Jesus, the mission strategy, and what Paul's future role would be. This, however, gives much more credibility to Paul than he seems to have had among the Nazarenes. Paul portrays himself as unknown by sight to the churches in Judea, which means that he did not get any circulation among the synagogues. Peter and James certainly knew his reputation as a persecutor, now proclaiming a new and highly provocative version of the faith he once tried to destroy in a more obvious manner. It seems that there was a great deal of hostility toward Paul, and many people were not accepting of his new image or the cover story. The Nazarenes were not naive, and they had enough experience with persecution and infiltration not to accept this alleged convert on sight. Although Paul tries to make us believe he chose not to see the other apostles, it may very well have been that they chose not to see him. Rather than take him around to display this miracle of a resurrected Jesus' latest contact, the miracle of a resurrected Jesus' latest contact, Paul was snubbed by the Jerusalem church. If Paul's intent was to become a part of the Nazarene community in Jerusalem, his mission failed, and his first encounter bred only distrust and suspicion. The entire process of infiltration had to be aborted after Paul's initial meeting with James. The hostility toward Paul was not just personal. It actually broke out into group violence. Paul does not supply any information on this event. The later account in Acts 9:29 shows Paul preaching to Grecian Jews who tried to get hold of Paul and put him to death. The author of Acts invariably makes the Christians look good and the Jews look bad. It is thus Hellenized Jews who are hostile to Paul's story and the good apostles who saved Paul. Since we do not know what he was preaching, we cannot say for sure what the dispute was about. What is clear is that Paul appears to be the only one in danger of being killed. Peter and James are not threatened by fellow Jews. If the content of what Paul said in any way resembled Paul's later preaching, however, the militant wing of the Nazarenes would have had a bigger complaint against him than anyone. Notice that the Nazarene leadership does not defend, hide, or protect him. Acts cannot say this because the author is constantly trying to minimize any differences between Paul and the Jerusalem apostles. The latter tradition wants to present Paul as walking in their footsteps and their traditions, when in fact his aims were diametrically opposed to theirs. Paul is, for the second time, homeless and a fugitive. He is immediately spirited out of the area to a Boston imperial enclave called Caesarea, and then shipped off to a Roman protectorate called Tarsus. Could it be possible that it was the Romans who arranged his escape? He traveled to Tarsus, presumably because his family could protect him, and it was very far away from Jerusalem. Additionally, how coincidental is it that as soon as the agent provocateur is disposed of in Acts 9:30, how coincidental it is that as soon as the agent provocateur is disposed of, Acts 9:30 tells us, the assemblies throughout the whole of Judea, Galilee, and Samaria now enjoyed peace. Paul's journey home seems entirely motivated by the fear of being killed by his enemies, not by a desire to spread his religious message in a particular location. Many have argued that his retreat to Tarsus brought him isolation, but in reality he could not only reconnect with his family, but also with their Roman patrons. Having been chased out of both Damascus and Jerusalem, perhaps only his home province seemed safe. We do not know if this was a period of retirement for Paul. He tells us nothing about this period of his life. We know of it only through Acts. Scholars have argued about how long the visit home lasted. Paul at least had time to rest, regroup, plan his next move, and then link up with Barnabas for his next mission in Antioch. All of this seems very mysterious and makes no sense at all. As usual, the picture in Acts has huge discrepancies and does not mesh with the one in Galatians. In the meantime, Tarsus was an excellent base for operations. It was not only the metropolis of Cilicia, but it was the second most important center after Antioch in the double province between Cilicia and the West. Possessing a seaport through which information flowed, and as a crossroads for travel, it was the springboard to Asia Minor. Paul had a source of money, close contact with Roman legions, and a Jewish community in which to work. He could launch the next chapter of his career as he searched for a new home base. Okay, that's the end of that section. I'm just trying to see how much time we have. And I can't. It's so hard to see this thing. Okay. This next section is called Antioch. Paul's next adventure started when Barnabas fetched him in Tarsus. There is no record of how Barnabas knew where to find Paul. If Paul had fled for his life from Jerusalem, he would not have left his forwarding address with the people who were hunting him down. There is a remarkable lack of controversy in Acts surrounding the arrival in Antioch of the former persecutor and his mentor. A certain amount of distrust would have been inevitable, since at least one of these two men was both well known and disliked in Jerusalem. The members of the Nazarenes who had gone to Antioch to flee persecution would certainly be on their guard and distrustful of a notorious persecutor, one who visited them out of the blue and was totally uninvited. It seems unlikely that none of the members of the Jesus movement in Antioch knew who Paul was. Acts glosses over the issue and tells us that Paul and Barnabas were welcomed by the Jesus followers in Antioch. The complete lack of suspicion in Antioch, according to Acts, and Paul's lack of candor raise questions about the veracity of the story Paul told in Antioch and the recounting in Acts. Had Paul introduced himself honestly by saying that as Saul of Tarsus he had recently been working on as a persecutor, there is no doubt that some would have distrusted him. We should also consider that the role of his accomplice Barnabas, we should consider the role of his accomplice Barnabas. He was speaking on Paul's behalf without having been present at the conversion itself. Could it be possible that he was working for the same authorities as Paul? Did the Romans send Barnabas to Tarsus to get Paul and then send both of them to Antioch? We have a clue here that persecuting the Jesus movement was not solely Paul's conviction, taken up on his own initiative, but that it was more likely an organized effort on behalf of the authorities. After all, it seems unlikely that a substantial number of Nazarenes would be scattered all the way to Damascus, Antioch, Cyprus, and Phoenicia. If it were only Paul who was after them, Barnabas, who had been sent to get Paul, may have been the senior member of the team. Barnabas had done reconnaissance in Antioch and concluded that some members of the original Jesus movement had fled persecution. He went to Antioch to contact fellow Nazarenes. The nucleus of the congregation had come from Judea as refugees from persecution after the death of Stephen, and some of them had started a deliberate outreach to the Greeks, as you can see in Acts 11:19. Antioch had one of the largest Jewish communities outside the Jewish homeland in the Roman period. It is estimated that something like 40,000 Jews lived there. There must have been many Jewish congregations and subsections of the city in and through which Paul could have operated. Antioch was the second largest city in the Eastern Roman Empire and the center of Rome's military presence in the East. It was known for its importance in trade. Antioch was also home to a large Roman military presence. The Legion 12 Fulminata was stationed near Antioch. Considering the size and economic importance of the city, it must have housed a substantial law enforcement community about which we have no specific details. Part of its job must have been to keep an eye on the dissident community in the region. Acts never explicitly mentions any government operations against the dissidents in Antioch, yet we know the authorities had launched an operation against members of the same movement in Damascus. If there was a mission to Damascus, it would not be unreasonable to think there could be a similar mission to Antioch. It is unlikely that the Romans would allow a dissident movement to take root there without inaugurating any kind of action to oppose it themselves. It is possible that the author of Acts fails to mention this in order to disconnect the Romans from the persecutions, and thus from persecutors such as Paul. Okay, let's see. There's no breaking points around, so let's try to just see if we can read one more paragraph here. The Antioch Nazarenes exercised considerable independence of thought and practice, and may have been ripe for someone trying to drive a wedge between them and the Jerusalem Nazarenes, especially if the Antioch branch was working among Gentiles. This would be fertile ground for preaching a new message, allowing the association between Jews and Gentiles to go unhindered by the requirements of the Mosaic ritual purity laws, specifically waiving the requirement of circumcision for Gentile converts to Christianity. Any number of scholars have pointed to Barnabas